It's a clear day. How are you going to record to the cloud?
To the big cloud. The internet cloud in the sky. I won't go into what happened there, but I'd spend an inordinate amount of time fixing a recording because it was broken up into 19 different segments that I had to pull back together and align. So I'm not going to do that again. So again, the overlap that exists, as we talked about, between the movements of the Great Awakening, the American Revolution, and then what happens in the early expansion of the United States, that's what promulgates the denominations that we have that are most predominant today. That's the reason that becomes important. That's how they spread. Just like Catholicism spread to the New World as a result of exploration activities and colonization activities in Central and South America. A similar phenomenon is happening here in the United States with Western expansion, manifest destiny, all the things that go on with that. This does play into and tie back to the Civil War because there were elements of that were contested inside denominations. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Particularly, that's true how we came to have Southern Baptists distinct from other Baptists as a result of what's leading up to that and then what happens after that. So we'll spend a little time in that. But this is a really good video on the First Great Awakening. Some characters you're going to know from here. We've talked about Wesley a number of times. This is going to focus a lot on Whitefield. As I mentioned before, he's going to make reference here to Jonathan Edwards, which we also didn't watch the Jonathan Edwards video. So let me just give the quick, I can't do Jonathan Edwards justice in 3 minutes, but I'll try. Very much more of a Puritan type of approach to theology with Edwards, but he's one of the two preachers that's probably best known for activities during the Great Awakening and evangelistic, revivalistic type of preaching. Probably without a doubt, if you ask anyone who sort of doesn't know, they will know Edwards from nothing else, probably from his most famous sermon, which is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is very much a evangelistic sermon, although it's not quite what it sounds like it ought to be in terms of that idea of the angry God, but it is talking about the need for salvation experience. Remember, all of this ties back to that era of Lutheran pietism that we sort of covered on, with emotionalism being brought into the equation. We're going to spend some time today talking about that because the way that plays out because of the Great Awakening is theology versus emotionalism. And how do you balance? What's the balance between those two things and what makes it hard? So that being said, Don's going to shut up. Let somebody who's a lot smarter than him, who knows it a lot better than him, talk.
In this lecture, we're looking at the First Great Awakening and the rise of a real different movement that came along with the Evangelical Awakening that featured some experimentation with preaching that both gave shape to all of the subsequent history of the evangelical world and which contributed to the breakdown of the institutional church as the sole governing body that could control doctrine and practice in the life of the church. And we can begin by just talking about the key players here in the Awakening. The men we're going to focus on in this lecture, we've already looked at in some detail, men like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Whitefield and Edwards are the two major players that spark the movement of the Great Awakening, that support it from within their theological framework. And though they both were churchmen in their own right, and though they both supported the life of the church, it is their support of the Great Awakening which gives it so much importance and that ushers in this new age of revivalistic preaching in the New World. And the importance of the Great Awakening is in part due to its interpretation. Historians have always been arguing.
Actually, let's stop and talk about that because that term's going to come up a number of times. So maybe we should make sure we are looking at that term the same way or understand what we mean by it. Revival. What does that conjure up for you?
For the church, basically, a focus on returning to things that you should be doing that you've probably gotten away from doing.
A renewal of vibrant faith.
Yeah. To me, the key thing to focus on there, I think both of those are right. The key thing there is the re. Because that's suggesting that something already existed. You're reing it.
Yes.
In order to re something, it had to be whatever the right prefix is for, it had to be proto, it had to be first in order to read it. And so the fact that we're talking about revival and renewal, and using those types of terminology suggests that we're talking about something that, again, as Kathy said, already exists, but needs to be, or there's another one, refreshed. So there's that context that's in there. Now, very often, even in the 20th century, and even, I guess in the 21st century, we talk about having like a revival meeting. In many instances, we do think of those as being more evangelical, in the sense that they may be, and I'm using that in the sense of actually not evangelical, evangelistic, to be clear about. Those are not the same term. They don't mean the same thing. To be more evangelistic, which, so there you think about Billy Graham and an open stadium crusade or some of the things that are there. And many times those are often called and referred to in using the term revival. I think that both of those are true of the Great Awakening if you want to attach revival to it. Most of the folks who lived in, and this was not just contained in the US, this happened in Great Britain as well. I mean, this was sort of a global thing to a great degree among English-speaking peoples, at least. I don't know so much what's going on down in Australia now. I'm curious to go and check that out, but something had to be happening down there. They needed it. A bunch of convicts have been sent down there. So, but it was, I think it was true to say, you probably weren't living in England or living in New England, either one, and not knowing who God was. The very idea that you were so disconnected, so non informed as to not understand even maybe the most basic things about, I think is very unlikely. It's amazing to me now when I talk to people, the number of people that live in our culture, partly because we have a multicultural, diverse, international flair to our culture that we didn't have before, that don't, who is Jesus? Well, I don't know who Jesus is, rather than, very, very base level, he's the guy that Christianity is all about. What do you know about it beyond that? Something about a cross. The rest of it would be almost lost upon them. That's not the case when Whitefield and I mean, there was knowledge here. Now, whether you were actively engaged, whether you were involved, the spirit to which you were doing that is what's different there. So it's a little bit different than what you might think of as being purely evangelistic, but it was to a degree also evangelistic.
Wasn't the Bible a good portion of that educational system?
Yes, in fact, almost every major university in the United States started out as a divinity school,
Correct.
or theological seminary, or both of some variety. And that's true of basically all the Ivy League schools, for example, were all seminaries or theological schools before they translated over. And the idea that we have of university level education, that was by the way, that was true in England, I mean, true in Europe as well. I mean, that's what most of the universities centered around that. Now later, with the Age of Enlightenment and the rise of the Age of Reason, the idea that these would also be places that taught other subjects and did other things became more the norm.
Right.
But yeah, no doubt. And in fact, the typical thing that people learned to read based out of was the Bible. It was the one. Books were still not plentiful even after post Gutenberg. It was still, I think about this. Where I think about my office now, which has shelves along one wall full of books. If you transported somebody from 1600 into either of these rooms, and they had never seen probably that many books collected in one place in their life, unless it was at a university library, or perhaps maybe at a large enough church if they were close enough to have one.
Thomas Jefferson had a pretty extensive library, but it wasn't that large as far as we're concerned.
Yeah, it became the basis for the Library of Congress. He donated all that he had to there.
Right.
And they've got a few more books now, but yeah. So
building.
yeah. So this idea I want to just talk, because he's going to use the term revival. Revival. What do we mean by revival? Well, it's what we think it means, but it's also a little bit different because the timing and the context is a little bit.
Doing almost ever since as to what the Great Awakening's significance was in the life of America. There are lots of different threads that have been followed. There are lots of different conclusions as to what the final results were. And we can name three of them here. There are three things that historians tend to believe. Some have a pretty wide consensus amongst historians, others do not. But it's often these three things that are cited as the importance of this revivalistic preaching. The first is that this movement, the Great Awakening, is the beginning or the origin of what would eventually become known as fundamentalism. And we're going to look at fundamentalism more specifically in a later lecture. Fundamentalism is the movement that really is reactionary against intellectuals, those in power, whether in the government or in the academy. And it tends to be a ruralization, we might say, of the goals and the aims of the church. It's more out in the territories that are no longer the main players of America. And a lot of historians are not quite sure about this one. The main problem here, of course, is that both men who are really the drivers of the Great Awakening, George Whitefield and Edwards, are themselves not fundamentalist. They are orthodox, they are confessional, they believe many of the same doctrines in many of the same ways that Protestants had always believed from the time of the early 16th century. And so noticing a genealogy from this point of the Great Awakening all the way down until the fundamentalist movement and then end of the 20th century is a bit suspect. It doesn't quite hold water. The second is that it is the Great Awakening, the first one in particular, that sparks the, at least, culture throughout the populace of what would become the American Revolution. Now, the idea here is that the way that the Great Awakening serves to drive people away from institutional authority, away from the higher-ups, the elites of society, in this case, the pastors and the bishops of their churches, and it drives them to come, however they will, to a non-institutional public preaching of the gospel. The idea here is that this is a populist understanding of the way to do church. It's about bringing everyone together. It's about the simple preaching of the gospel. It flies in the face of a number of church leaders, whether in the Presbyterian Church or the Congregational Church or in the Anglican Church, who did not want the Great Awakening and who challenged it. And there is certainly something to this. Not all historians are convinced at this point, but there is something here about the way the Great Awakening fits hand in glove with the American culture, which says that we are not supposed to trust those in authority fully for everything, and that power and authority, and in some cases, the decisions are to be left in the hands of John Doe and Jane Doe, the average person. Still, though, this is not the political Reformation by any means. The suggestion here by historians is that what the Great Awakening provides is a softening of the pill that America has to swallow as it moves from a British colony to its own republic, with its new invention of a democracy and its new privilege and its new desire to see the average person involved in civil life and in political life, even to the point of the decision-making that is required in government. Again, though, it's not a one-to-one parallel. It's certainly not easy to prove this, at least beyond a shadow of a doubt. The third point, and this is the one we're going to focus on a bit more here, is that the First Great Awakening is the beginning of emotional revivalism. Now, this is obvious. This is very, very clear.
Diana, can you see and hear the video?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I can.
Okay, sorry, I was getting a text from Sherry that she was hearing something but not seeing the text, and we don't have her as joining the meeting. So sorry to pause and interrupt things.
So
Not a
I
problem.
can turn on the closed caption from we may get some interesting things that come up there because the way that it does it in real time. But
There had been some revivals for sure. There had been emotional responses for sure. The Protestant world, in fact, all of church history, is not emotionally dead. The church has always said that people need to be emotionally involved with their faith. What is happening here, though, in the Great Awakening is there is a lurch forward in terms of the privilege of the emotional life for the Christian. The idea here is that those who come to the faith need to do so primarily through the emotions. They need to have these ecstatic experiences, emotional responses of a number of different things. They need to be heartfelt. They need to be very, very ecstatic, to use a word that was very popular in this day. It's not principally a revolution or a revival of the mind. This is not about new doctrines, new thoughts. Though, of course, there's always doctrine that's in play. There are always things that are being discussed at an intellectual level. No, what's going on here is really a privileging of the emotional life. And we've seen this arise as the Reformation has carried on. We saw this in Lutheran pietism, for example, the move from doctrine to emotions. It wasn't so much the adding of one to the other, but rather a replacement of one for the other. Emotions become the central thing. Doctrine and confession become the secondary thing, or sometimes further down the line in terms of its importance for the Christian life. So each in their own way, these three interpretations of the Great Awakening should signal for us some of the ways that historians have approached the subject. We're always concerned, really, not so much with the Great Awakening itself, though it is important and a very interesting time. Rather, it's a bit like the Reformation. Luther and Calvin are interesting on their own, but they're interesting in part, if not primarily, because of the ongoing effects of both of their theologies and both of the movements that their names are attached to. Well, it's that way with the Great Awakening. It's not so much that these are moments in time that sort of stand alone, but rather these are times when a lot of new things are coming into the church, a lot of new desires are being expressed, and a new emotional revivalism is underway in terms of the goals of the church with its evangelism. Now, if those are the instincts of the way we're going to approach this, if these are the goals to see the impact of the Great Awakening, well, what's the context? Well, the context is vitally important to understand because I think for most of us, we tend to misapply or misunderstand what is going on in the American colonies before the Revolutionary era and shortly thereafter. The context is, simply put, that America has gotten a bit fat and a bit lazy. Now, we don't mean that pejoratively, and we don't mean that to be a moral judgment upon the people during this day. But we have to remember, just as the Pilgrims did not come to the New World in and of themselves to suffer hardship, but rather they came because there were so many economic opportunities in the New World. When we get to this period of time in the mid-1700s, what's going on here is there's actually a great deal of prosperity that has come upon the New World. People have gotten rich, whether it's through the sale of tobacco, sugar, cotton, whether it's through trade, any number of different things. The Americas were a boom town during the 1700s. As a result, people are more wealthy and therefore more leisured. If you add to that the fact that the American slave trade has really taken off and has now become thoroughly ingrained in the life of the Americas, well, a lot of these people who are now wealthy and leisured are also doing so on the backs of very cheap labor, rather through their own sweat and tears. That only compounds the value of all of these farms and production houses, and it contributes to the fact that those who are slave owners, those who are the wealthy, can grow even more wealthy and more leisured as a result of slave labor. This is also a time of pretty intense urbanization. It only makes sense coming out of the Pilgrim and the colonial period. People are going to band together. You really only have a suburban or a ruralization of living arrangements, not only in America, but in other countries around the world throughout history. Whenever the urban populations become more fixed, more established, and sometimes a bit corrupted or different than the values of the people that eventually move out. Put simply, people tend to move away from dense populations whenever more lucrative options are available outside of these urban centers, or whenever they find themselves fundamentally different, culturally, religiously, ethnically at times, from the urban cores where they exist. Now, sometimes this is a good thing. Sometimes there are lands to be conquered and areas to settle, new commerce and new produce to grow, for example. Other times, of course, it's a negative thing. Things like white flight as people leave urban cores because they're becoming too ethnically diverse. Well, in this day and age, it's not really matured to the point that you have a great deal of ruralization or people leaving in large numbers from the urban centers of places like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, etc. It's still really an urban world. Next, and this is a point that's not often believed by the modern world about this period of time, but it had become common in this day and age to accuse those who were more wealthy in these urban centers of becoming distracted and lazy, either in terms of their work life, their political life, or in the case of what's important right here, in terms of their religious life. Now again, I think we tend to always have rose-colored glasses when we're looking on the past. The culture wars, the fights, the troubles in the church or without always seem worse in whatever generation you're living in. And so it always seems to be the case that the time around the American Revolution is something of the high watermark for the Christian faith, at least in terms of North America. Again, we need to add some more color to that portrait. This is the time of the Enlightenment. This is a time when people are losing faith as often as they are gaining it. This is a time when folks are not as open to regular church worship, or at least serious belief, as they had been maybe in the 16th century. And this is on the lips of all the Puritan or North American preachers at one time or another. They're all
We didn't go into a tremendous amount of detail about this, 'cause I didn't want to veer off into that, because we could really, that rabbit hole could go deep. Enlightenment, the age of enlightenment. What do you know about that?
This beginning of focus on science and on observable data, learning about the world, learning about everything from what you could observe and verify.
Yeah, I think mentioning science is a key way of describing it, Doug. It was the beginning of the scientific age. And that led into sometimes what's called the age of reason.
I was gonna say, I thought it also sort of separated emotions from things and begins to really separate your faith from stuff.
It becomes more of a, you can use the scientific concept, more of an empirical way of looking at the world versus I want to know facts. I don't want to have to rely upon faith. It might be a good way to summarize it in a big way. Now, it's important to understand, I think we talked about this 3 or 4 weeks ago. We have this conflict that exists tremendously today between like science and religion, where it's like science has become a religion for some folks. And there's this opposition, scientists, this is painting with such a broad brush that we know it's not true kind of thing. All scientists are atheists, for example. And they're anti anything that has to do with God or theism or anything that suggests that there's something outside of natural causes for things to happen. This is a Darwin kind of approach to how things came to be, or other types of things that are out there. Understanding that very early on, as the scientific revolution is starting to happen and science is really starting to grow in ways that it hadn't until the Renaissance, until what goes on. But like a lot of the early, Newton, for example, wrote theological treatises. I mean, they were not divorced from, because they were scientists did not mean that they were divorced from faith. Later, by the time we get to the latter part of the 18th century, certainly into the 19th century, more what we think about here is that modern clash between science and religion exists.
Well, I guess for me, and again, I am not the history person, but I thought that like so much of it, the church actually didn't like the scientists. Like even the thing about the earth isn't the center of the universe. The sun, even the sun
When you
is
say
not
the
necessarily
church, you have to remember too, some of that's Catholicism.
true, right? But like if the scientists were discovering things that disagreed with the church was very violent towards these scientists. So then you get all the way to the point where like Asimov or Carl Sagan, who, is completely, he's a scientist, but like
He's a
there's no
phony
way in the
scientist.
world.
He's a very phony scientist.
But he's very well received by lots of people.
Yeah, because they don't do any homework.
I agree with you. But it's hard for me to understand how initially a lot of the scientists were very, very, very raised in the church and stuff like that.
But because
It
we live
becomes that
because we
point.
live in an age where now it typically represents itself as clash.
Yeah.
It's harder for us to imagine that there was a time where that clash didn't exist. But to the point, Lori mentioned as well, Copernicus, for example, being the best example of this, Galileo being one. Galileo was labeled a heretic. Basically, I'm just telling you what the math says. I'm telling you what the math says.
Well, I think in some respect, when sciences were really developing, the intent was really to learn about the world, but learning about God in the process. But
That's
over
the key
time-
right there.
But over time, the enemy has come in, put these little seeds in, and enemy knows you don't just make a boom change, you make a little change over time. And that divorce became bigger and bigger and bigger, so that now science and faith have a hard time operating together.
I've heard some
Wouldn't you
evidence.
say, it seems to me that, yeah, as Kathy and y'all have mentioned, the opposition of the church, the church, the institution to the early scientists was very strong. And the impetus or the aggressive mode was from organized religion against the scientists. But I would say by the time you have the complete coming in power of the Enlightenment, the late 18th century, the early 19th century, it's turned on its head, and the scientists, the secular world is antagonistic to faith. They are the ones that are leading the attack, and the church has become more defensive and even stagnant, as it said.
Well, I mean,
Sometime in there.
Darwin wasn't. I mean, Darwin, I don't know,
And
because
Darwin
I've
claimed
never
to be
starred him.
Yeah. Didn't he claim to be a Christian when he?
No, his
when he
wife
began
was. I don't
his-
think he was.
I was gonna
necessarily.
say, I don't think he ever claimed to be, but
Yeah,
he
but-
certainly,
The problem now is that you follow the science. That's a very popular theme among especially the ultra left, which they're not. The reality is that if you follow the science, we're more right. And as
Oh.
time goes by,
I think,
you have the creation time period. What was it? The particular time period in our evolution of this planet, in which all of a sudden life just incredible numbers of various types of species are developed. They have absolutely no idea how that happened. It's just boggling the amount of life that the Cambrian, I think it's a Cambrian period, in which just life was extremely abundant. And prior to this time, they said that, matter has always existed. And that's not true. They've also pointed out that you have to have this amount of time in order for things to develop. Cambrian time period was a very short, very small time period as far as the Earth is concerned. And you've got an enormous amount of science now. You've got the DNA, you've got all sorts of things now that we're beginning to realize it's an extremely, extremely complicated process. The very fact that the universe is in existence I think that you cannot imagine. My understanding is if you add up all the atoms in the entire universe, that number is not as large as the possibilities that you need in order for this universe to begin to exist. It's staggering the amount of science. And also the Christian church, I don't think we would have science right now if it hasn't been for the Christian church, because they, like we're talking about here, we're talking about the fact that they believed in God. Everything was created, everything's in its order. There's no chaos, there's order. And consequently, you by observation can see what's going on.
And I agree with all of that. The challenge there, I'm gonna be the advocate for the other side. because I
That's
don't want
fine,
to be,
that's
but-
fine.
But to put the perspective there, the first person that dug up some dinosaur bones. So you're a Christian. A logical question to ask is, how do I reconcile this by what I see in God's word? Because I don't see this really, maybe it's there, I've seen the explanations for that, but maybe, going, this exists, I can see it, it's tangible, I'm touching it, I'm here, but what's this about? That raises questions. And then ultimately you have to decide where you're going to take your answers to those questions from. You can take them from purely based on faith, which is what had been done for a huge portion of the church. You could take it based purely on science, which was the new emerging thing. It actually was just a re-emerging of things that had happened before. I mean, we have the Dark Ages in between there. I mean, the Renaissance is called the Renaissance. There's that re-word again, coming back of things that we lost and that others had known before, that we quote unquote discovered. And then, really, if you look at since, I'm going to say the last 4 centuries, obviously since the early 17th century, without a doubt, this has been the ongoing clash of how do you reconcile those two things together. And what has happened a lot in the last probably 30 to 40 years is you have a push by scientists who are also believers
Mhm.
to come back and bring science into the perspective of saying there's still an element of faith required here.
Right.
But I have ways of explaining this in a way that would suggest that a great example is life. DNA is a great example. Just the fact that there seems to be there is intelligent design. You've heard the watchmaker analogy is probably the most commonly
Right.
used one there. And from my perspective, not just because I'm a believer, but because that also makes sense to me scientifically.
Correct.
The belief that the number of accidents you have to have happen over and over and over and over again, if this really came to being without an external influence, creator, God, we are the end of the biggest lottery ticket that's ever been won. In
Mhm.
terms of if you want to look
Yeah.
at what the odds were. I mean, it's just so
Staggering.
staggering.
Yeah,
to
the
be-
amount of faith required to believe
That-
that is much greater.
That's exactly where I was going. But you can understand why this tension exists, and this tension, tying back to what we're talking about, this tension is really starting to rise during this particular point of time. And as Reeves is well pointing out, the structure of economies were changing as well. Because the other thing that's going to come along here that's right after this, it's already started, but it's really going to come in a big way, is the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution, because we're going to talk about this in a way that it influenced our modern denominations as well. The Industrial Revolution and the impact of economy there is probably even more profound than what we're dealing with here. In the sense that you want to talk about the things that shape and change society, economics shape and change society more than anything else does outside of potentially what the church is doing in society, and even more so in many instances. The church is going to be influenced by the rise of industrialization in some positive ways and also in some very, very negative ways. We have that as one thing. But for example, what happens with urbanization? What happens with disruption to family life because of working in a factory schedule versus an agrarian schedule, for example, that comes into play, is going to be a major influence on what happens. In fact, some of the later awakenings, because there continue to be these waves of revivalism that happen. Some of them later happen because they're happening in factory settings or around factory settings, which is sort of happening a little bit here. But when we talk about a factory here in colonial New England, we're not talking about what you think of as being a factory. We're talking, yes, there was, but mass production, the assembly line type approach has not come along yet. Textiles are being done in factories, but not to the degree that they are now. This is the influence that's coming with society. And so this is a period of clash, which is the point of these. He's already mentioned it here. There's this impression, rightfully so, that Americans have grown to some degree, certainly the wealthy, like have become a little bit, fat, dumb, and happy, kind of, and they were doing it, and he's absolutely correct. Many of them were doing it on the backs of the labor of others. The reason they weren't working, somebody else was working for them, or you were benefiting from that. For example, we look at the South and we go, okay, there's the plantation experience, cotton production. Exactly, the cotton production in the South, or sugar production in the Caribbean, relied upon slave labor to be profitable. New England merchants and sailors were the ones who were moving those slaves from Africa to the New World. And the finished goods were going back to England, so they were happy to have all of this be in place. From molasses to slaves. This is the song for the musical 1776, the triangular trade. Everybody was benefiting from this. And that's why, even though you had a number, for example, abolitionists later in New England, very much opposed to slavery, but they sure were benefiting from what was going on with it. This was the tension that we find ourselves in. This is the backdrop for where we are here.
Always trying to shake people awake. Stop relying on your prosperity and the luxuries that you can afford. Take seriously your faith. Or for those who have become deistic or atheistic, there's always a call for people to return to the faith. Lastly, though, the context of the First Great Awakening is really at the pregnant moment when all of these denominations in the New World have finally reached a point where they are melting together, and there is a breakdown in the distinctiveness of people that had come from the old world, transplanted in America, and their children or their children's children might no longer identify as being part of the same church as their forefathers and foremothers. This is a day when folks could not so much select which denomination they want to be a part of, though of course they could. This wasn't a time where there was extensive hopping around from church to denomination, as it is so much a lightening of the burden of what it meant to be, say, a Baptist or a Congregationalist or a Presbyterian. And so what's going to happen in the First Great Awakening is the big revivals that are being preached principally up in New England are going to be one of these real serious moments where people come together in a way that they never had before in Protestant history. Now, there are moments, of course, of irenic and ecumenical movements throughout the history of Protestantism. There are times where folks will metaphorically reach across the aisle to someone who is a bit different from them. But these are not real serious mixtures of all kinds of different folks coming together to see themselves as one body from whom each individual might go out into a different denomination. That is what we're going to see in the First Great Awakening, a serious moment where all of these different groups come together for the sake of a single preacher preaching the gospel and evangelizing. Well, okay, so who are the players? Well, they are, as we've already said, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Now, we had an entire video on Jonathan Edwards and his life and some elements of his theology, so we're not going to rehash all of those pieces here. We've looked a little bit at the life of George Whitefield, but we only really looked at George Whitefield in relationship to John Wesley on the subject of predestination. We need to understand where he's coming from and some of the rationale and some of the impulses and instincts that Whitefield has as a revival preacher. Whitefield was born in 1714 and he died in 1770. He was born in the city of Gloucester. His family, like the Wesleys, had a large number of children. Whitefield was the fifth of 17 children, to be exact.
17.
And we've already looked at the story in brief, but he goes on to the University of Oxford, where he is actually a poor student. He is what they call, by translation at least, a server. He's not there on scholarship, and the way he would work his way through the universities and the way he would pay his fees is he would do things that frankly made him the butler of the more wealthy students. He'd take out their trash, he'd shine their shoes, he'd draw their bath, and sometimes he'd serve them at table. Now, this was, again, seen as a bit of a scholarship, a work scholarship, and he certainly was getting a wonderful education, but he was certainly part of the have-nots and not part of the haves. He joins the Holy Club, of course, and he becomes a good friend of Charles Wesley. And we've covered a lot of this, of course, but in the 1730s, when John Wesley goes down to Savannah, it is George Whitefield who takes over the Holy Club for a period of time. At this point, Wesley and Whitefield actually are somewhat ships passing the night, as Wesley fails in the city of Savannah, and he heads back to London, where he takes part in the Aldersgate revival with the Moravians, the thing that led to his conversion. During that same time, in 1738, Whitefield himself comes down to Savannah. He serves as a pastor and as a social worker, we might say, though not in terms of social work as we might say today, which is often more political. In this case, he is a pastor leading a group of transplanters from England to the New World to Georgia, helping them understand and develop a culture of how they're going to serve each other. One of the more important things that Whitefield gets involved with is the planting of a number of orphanages for the poor there in Georgia. Later in his career, he will actually be involved with planting an orphanage for those who were the children of slaves. And there are any number of reasons why children would be very vulnerable in this day and age. Whitefield plays a part in establishing an orphanage for slave children. One of the more enduring ones that he plants, though, is called the Bethesda Orphanage. Now, the Bethesda Orphanage is actually still in existence today. Actually, it is the single longest charitable organization in the entire history of America. It's gone through a number of different names. More recently, it was called the Bethesda School for Boys, though it has since changed its name. But this is in the city of Savannah, and Whitefield is very committed to looking after orphan children. So he is there in Savannah, again in 1738, preaching, pastoring, and engaging in social work. He then travels up and down the eastern coast. In particular, he makes his way to New England, where he meets Jonathan Edwards and a number of the New England Calvinist pastors, the Puritan pastors that are in the areas in Boston and in the surrounding Massachusetts areas. And Whitefield begins to press himself into the service of revivalistic preaching here in America. He had done a great deal of this back in England. Up and down the country, he had preached revival, often to the poor and to anyone who would come out and see him. Well, he begins to do this in North America, and he has a great deal of success, and there's a great deal of fruit that comes out of this. He would preach outdoors at times to thousands and thousands of people. Now, historians always comment, according to stories and accounts of Whitefield's preaching from his own day, from eyewitness men and women who had gone to hear him preach, Whitefield was graced with some kind of staggeringly massive, booming, rich voice that could carry not to the back of the rafters per se in a closed auditorium, but could somehow fill a field so that thousands of people listening to him could still hear his voice and could be drawn in to the power of his preaching. He had a lot of natural gifts, we might say, in the modern world. And Whitefield, again, would ride up and down the coast. He would be saddle sore, thousands upon thousands of miles, preaching to thousands upon thousands of people. His goal in all this was to preach evangelism, to preach the new birth, to preach the goal of the Christian life, which is to know Christ and his works. What's important about his revivals, though, is they spark, in part, though principally through his efforts, this first Great Awakening. You might say that these revivals were non-denominational or interdenominational. They brought all kinds of folks together just to hear the preaching of the gospel. Whitefield would simply preach Christ, preach resting on him and his works on the cross. And then he would hold out the opportunity for folks to make a commitment to Christ at the end of his preaching. He very often liked to end his sermons with the following, quote, "Come poor, undone sinner, come just as you are." And again, the reaction to Whitefield's preaching was always pretty staggering. None other than Ben Franklin himself went to hear Whitefield preach. And Ben, of course, is a deist. He doesn't really care all that much about faith. He himself is a man of science, and he's really certainly part of this more radical enlightenment that is underway. And Franklin actually says specifically about hearing Whitefield preach that he was mesmerized, that he found it pretty startling and actually very intriguing. He also makes a comment that really helps us understand what's going on here. Again, the context is of a loosening or a slacking of the faith in the New World, whether it's through opulence or indulgence, whether it's through just simply not finding the faith all that compelling, whatever it might be. Well, Ben Franklin actually says that, quote, "It seemed as if all the world were growing religious." Now, what does he mean here? Well, clearly, one of the things that he means is that it's not a very religious world. This is not a time of deep, passionate religious fervor. However, the Great Awakening is bringing some of this to bear here in the First Great Awakening. And again, it's really becoming a melting pot. Whitefield is preaching revival in a way that is bringing folks together for the sake of the faith and for the sake of increasing the faith amongst those who have grown lukewarm and of bringing back to the faith any who might have slipped away. And so Whitefield is, again, some of the propellant that pushes some of the Great Awakening forward. Jonathan Edwards, though, is himself one of the great supporters of the Great Awakening. And we mentioned some of this in our lecture on his life. He was really concerned about the integrity of the faith in New England. And he begins himself almost single-handedly to spark a revival or a Great Awakening in the city of Boston and surrounding Massachusetts areas, in particular the city of Northampton. Edwards' sermons were simply riveting for people listening to him in his day. And we should really stress that point because in the modern world, whenever people go back and read the sermons of Jonathan Edwards, its language is a bit more philosophical, its vocabulary a bit more remote from the modern world. He's very much an 18th century man, and the sermons, therefore, sound very 18th century. And this always makes people scratch their heads. Why in the world would this lead to a revival? Well, the answer in part is that in Edwards' day, he was speaking in language and in vocabulary that everyone could accept or embrace without much difficulty. One of the more interesting things about Edwards, though, is he really presses into his people that they should rely less and less on things called special providences, which in our vocabulary we might say are miracles, or little moments where God breaks in and changes things to be for our advantage or for our edification. Edwards, of course, is more of a man of science, and he appeals to the people, and he argues for them to consider God as the one who is through all and in all. It's not that God has sort of wound up the clock and allowed the universe to spin on its own, and he shows up from time to time here and there to give little moments of special providence. What Edwards stressed, in a typical Protestant vein, was that God is in everything. He is the sustainer as well as the provider. He shows up, yes, from time to time, but he is also the one who is very ordinary. He is in the natural world. He's in the home life. He's in everything that we do and say or speak. And therefore, we need to seek the glorification of God in everything, not simply wait around for the miracles. He also stressed very, very strongly that God can be known. He's not far off. He's not the eternal watchmaker far off in the sky. He is here in every moment, and he can be known intimately, and that is the goal of the Christian life. In the end, the Great Awakening here, just prior to the Revolutionary War, does seem to, again, bring together elements and all different denominations into these revivals that were short-lived, sure, but which had a dramatic impact because of the accent that American evangelicalism will forever place on revivals, big tent preaching, and the widespread call for everyone to come to the faith. In their own day, though, in the early to mid-18th century, these preachers and this revivalistic preaching did not always strike people as the best thing for the church. One of the great problems, of course, of revival preaching, or of a revival movement at any point in the church's history, is that there are usually, very often, no clear guidelines as to where emotionalism ends and where ecstatic, somewhat crazy excess begins. And this is true across denominations and branches of the church. If a movement begins with more ecstatic, spontaneous emotional outbursts, at times there are folks who will come along either to mimic that process or who, in the midst of the revivals themselves, will simply be unaware or unable to tell the difference between excess and an appropriate amount of emotional expression. So a great example of this is the Tennant family, as well as a man by the name of James Davenport. These folks, having heard the revival preaching, having supported it themselves, began to set about to really stoke up the revivals to an even greater extent than they had been done in the area of New England and in the preaching of George Whitefield. And just to give you a little bit of a taste as to some of the excesses, James Davenport is actually eventually arrested, and he is charged with insanity and with disturbing the peace. Something of a humorous outcome, but it's actually quite unfortunate because James Davenport is, again, simply trying to mimic the emotional preaching of the revivals, and he got out so far over his skis that he eventually took it too far. This is always the problem with a revivalistic movement, and it's not the ultimate problem, and it's certainly not the Achilles heel, but this is always something that comes up. Where does one end, and where does one begin with emotions versus a more ordinary, commonplace, day-by-day faith? Not everything can be hyper emotions and ecstatic experiences. God is the God of the ordinary as well. But what happens in the American colonies is this distinction and this problem actually begins to lead to a split. It is called the split between the old lights and the new lights, which is just simply a marker for the old lights or those who are relatively opposed to revival preaching, sometimes very hostile or mocking of those who take part in revival preaching, versus the new lights, people like Wesley and Whitefield, who are in favor of revivals and evangelism. And they are relatively, I wouldn't say anti-institutional, but they are certainly in favor of people coming as they are, in whatever form, whatever denomination they happen to be a part of, to hear the preaching of the gospel. So you're beginning to see a division between those who want to keep the established ways of doing church before, run by elders or bishops or other types of pastors, versus the new lights who, again, begin to take on a tone of something of the anti-establishment. And so, in the end, the Great Awakening contributed so much good to the life of the church, It gave evangelicalism its first great expression of emotional piety and revival preaching. But it also led to a split. And, more importantly, it was always fundamentally ambiguous as to who holds the power. Is it in the preachers? Is it in the people? Or is it back in the churches? Once the big revivals are over, these folks stream back and submit themselves to the discipline of the elders or to the bishop. And as we'll see as we go forward into our next lecture on the American Revolution and the church, that ambiguity, that tension, was a live one in the American colonies. And so as the American Revolution gets underway, and as it spills out into the post-revolutionary constitutional era of America, the impact on the church and its anti-institutionalism will only grow deeper.
Interesting. One of the things that jumped out at me in the whole thing there is think about Whitefield and Edwards. Whitefield was primarily in Georgia, not as far south as you can get in the British colonial experience in the Americas. And of course, Massachusetts, Boston is about as far as north as you can get.
Yeah.
So it was everything, both and in between that are part of what's going on there. And thinking about the fact that it was not just localized. This was not a localized thing. This was a large area or territory that was covered there. Then the last thing there, we'll pick up on the discussion for this next week if we're running out of time. But the last thing there is this idea of these are open air meetings, right? They're not happening in the church.
Yeah.
So what is the role of the church in these meetings? So these are not, again, Whitfield's not your local pastor. He's come in to deliver this. A lot of people have gone there. A lot of people have had a real experience, no doubt about that.
Well, Don, I got a quick question. What do you mean when you say the church?
I'm talking about in these cases, these would be the local churches, the
Okay.
organized local bodies of believers, not even just, the Catholic Church or even the
Well,
Anglican
that word
Church.
can mean so many things. That's
Right,
what it says.
about the local, about really the local congregation, the local church.
Okay.
It's a good point to clarify
Sorry.
what I mean, clarify what I mean, is they were not the ones they hadn't sponsored these meetings. These meetings had happened.
Yeah.
Have been sponsored outside of them. So then, okay, Whitfield came and all these people
Listen to him.
got revived and all of this, and now it's next week what happens, right?
So didn't we talk about that the reason they were doing open air meetings is because some of their beliefs were congruent with the local church bodies?
In some cases, yes. But in many cases here, these were the local believers who were going out to these revival meetings, and not like they were it's not like they were the unchurched, there was definitely that, but that was less of that. I mean, these were probably people who held a membership or an affiliation with a local church who were out there at one of these open air meetings in most instances. And so that's where this tension starts coming in. He touched on here, we'll talk about it. I'll walk through instead of watching a video. That's where this tension comes in between authority versus
We're back to what it all started with.
yeah, and these are, if you will, this is a religious populism to some degree that's gone on here, and that's good, except for some people who think that it's
Bad.
that it's bad. And so there's this tension that's going on as well that's happening here. And again, one is not causing the other directly in terms of this, the American Revolution, but they are feeding off of each other. There's a cycle that's going on here that's very, and also it's not happening in a couple of years, it's happening over a span of time. This is the 1730s into the 1740s. So we're still 30 years removed, plus 30 years plus removed from the start of the American Revolution. The revolutionary tendency started in the late 1760s, early 1770s, as a result of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and what happens after that, all that's happening there. But we're still almost a generation earlier than that.
Yeah.
But yet it's starting to build the reality of that. Questions, comments?
Kathy brought up an issue in which I think we need to re-examine, and that is that the church was flat earth. I think you had their scientists back then felt like it was flat earth, but the problem was I'm not so sure the total Catholic Church believed in that, because the sun is round, the moon is round, when you get, if you're a seaman, you know that there's a curvature. And I think it was 322 or something like that BC that one of the Greek scientists figured out the circumference of the earth, and he was just a couple hundred miles short. That's incredible. Basically what he did from Greece to, he knew that the sun on the equator at noon, there was no shadow.
Yeah, no, I mean,
I'm not
yeah,
criticizing you.
No. I don't know my history well enough to know, but I do remember hearing about how scientists were
There were
opposed by or
there were persecution of a number of different scientists and a number of
in their
different fields.
discoveries.
That's true too.
But
That's also true.
by the organized church, in this case, the Catholic Church, or in some cases by Protestant denominations who
and still going on.
Yeah. And, back to Mickey's point, I think we have a lot of what we were taught in school history is mythicized is a good way to describe it. It becomes
Very good.
mythical in the
Very
sense of there were a lot of people, so we have this idea that everybody thought the earth was flat. Columbus sailed and found this thing, and now suddenly the earth is round. No, that's not the way it worked. In fact, a number of the to your point, I want to say that was Strabo was the Greek who did that, but I may be wrong about that. But yeah, going back to before the time of Christ, there were Greek quote unquote scientists, philosophers and science were mixed together there pretty well. But who had done things like that, like I said, the natural thing. All of us have seen the idea of the horizon, the curvature of the earth,
Right.
all of that. So the church at times just did not get involved with that. But then there were times the church did get involved in that and the reason the church got involved is as the time came that science began to challenge other elements of faith, that's when the pushback came from the church to some degree to say, wait a second. And then you had more radical ideas about what was being challenged in terms of doctrine and authority and biblical, again, I'm challenged by creation. As a modern person, my faith is challenged by understanding exactly what happened. Is it that I don't believe that Genesis is, I believe that Genesis is true. I also believe that it was not written as a scientific treatise to explain what it was. And so its truth is not invalidated by the things that it does not say. But yet I struggle with that. For example, do I take the days as literal days, or are these epochs or eras? How do I explain the fact that there's days before there's a sun and a moon? Because those don't get created until later days. It's not on day one that you get even the creation of the things that we define days with now. Part of that is also our struggling to translate out of Hebrew into English, the translation aspect of translating what's there. Why are there what appear to be two creation accounts of Genesis? There's the broad creation account, and there's the specific human creation account of Adam. Is it heretical to suggest that there were humans created by God or that came into existence as a result of God's action other than Adam and Eve? I guarantee you, if I uttered that over in a building next door, I would be viewed by a lot of people in there as being heretical. I don't think that's heretical. I don't think that I know, but I don't think that the idea that there could have been other humans, that Adam and Eve are unique in their creation by God. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. And that does not invalidate God's word. Very close reading of God's word there. But
Precisely.
I also don't know what I don't know.
But you also have DNA that goes back to non-humans that we apparently have.
And what's that all
If
about?
you've got God who is eternal, and this right here is the time period we know about.
And again, I struggle with, okay, what were these dinosaurs? We're pumping oil and gas out of the ground now, which we believe came as a result of dead plants and dead animals that had to have been there for a long period of time. Again, I don't know.
There is now actual geological record that proves that man was alive during the time of the Dinosaurs.
Yeah. And so then the question
Some
becomes,
form.
what was the, when were the dinosaurs? When were the
Yeah.
dinosaurs? This idea of time. And I think we have better understanding of it now scientifically than we did before. And to Mickey's point, there are a number of, and thank God they exist, passionate scientists who are believers that are out there that are in the realm of explaining that you don't have to check your brain at the door.
Correct.
And at the same time, there is going to be and there will remain an element of faith involved in this because that's the nature of what it's going to be. And you have to choose who you have the faith in. You have the, because scientists ultimately have faith in the science, which is not a bad place to have some faith in. But is it the place to have an ultimate faith that exceeds a faith in God? The answer in my mind immediately becomes no. And so how do you balance that out? Where that's relevant to what we're talking about here, this is what was starting to come into play now, is the balancing out of these things and thinking that through. It's going to get far worse before it gets far better. In the 19th century, potentially the rise of a lot of German philosophical thought, among other things, Hegel. And if you ever read any Nietzsche, how much Nietzsche you ever read in your life, I was exposed to it in college. That's pretty brutal stuff when you're a believer the first time. You know, Nietzsche, of course, is famously known for saying that God is dead, which is his way of saying God never existed. We made up God. God's a fiction that we made up because we needed God, which I don't believe at all. But that's what it eventually morphs into just a couple of centuries later in this thing that's going on. And then even inside of our biblical scholarship, there's the criticism, the critical schools of the 19th century that come into being, you know, begin to challenge, for example, okay, Genesis appears to be like 4 books that are knitted together when we start doing this thing. So how did this come into being? And what is like the timing on this doesn't seem to make sense compared to something else. By the way, some of those criticisms come from a basis of some validity that doesn't invalidate the fact that it's God's work. You just have to now step back and say, what does this mean? Or what does this even not mean? Sometimes it's even more
And
important thing to
sometimes
say.
as humans, because we are so finite, we forget that God says, my ways are higher than your ways. And that's where the true faith really comes into play, and just trusting him when we don't understand or when we don't know. Because really, we don't have the capacity to grasp God.
Or even God's creation.
Yes.
God certainly, but even the things that are
Yes.
an order removed from God, what he created, and we obviously don't have the capacity to understand. I mean, the human body, all living organisms are such a, you know, talk about, you know, this being at the end of the ultimate lottery ticket here. You know, the happenstance things that would have to happen for you to have cells do what they do, and DNA does what it does, the ability to replicate itself, the ability to modify itself. In many instances, you get in this thing of, well, this had to come before that, but that had to come before this. How would that even happen in a natural system kind of problem that are resolved when you have a creator? You get out of that, you know, if God creates the chicken, you don't have to worry where the egg came from, right? Is what it ultimately turns into. But if you're without that, you struggle. Which of these came first, right? How did
Well,
this
maybe
happen?
he created them at the same time.
And he could have. And again, when Moses writes Genesis, it's not intended to be a scientific explanation of creation. This is a theological exposition of what creation is about.
Okay, we gotta go.
I know we gotta go. All right, guys. Thanks, guys. I'm stopping the recording
I
now.
was gonna say,
Maybe if I can find the controls to do that, I can stop the recording.